Follow the Money is made on the lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples. We pay our respects to elders past and present and acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded.
I can't see, at least from the outside, that the Australian government is prepared for that worst case scenario. Like, what are they going to do if that worst case scenario does play out? If Trump attempts to steal an election, if Trump successfully steals an election, what does that mean for the shared values that supposedly underpin that alliance? What does it mean for AUKUS? What does it mean for Australia?
One for Mum, one for Dad, and one for the country.
And there has never been a more exciting time to be an Australian.
Budgets are about choices, Fran, and you show what you value through the choices you make.
This is coal. Don't be afraid. Don't be scared.
The Treasurer knows. I want an economy that works for people, not the other way around.
We'll just end up being a third-rate economy, a banana republic.
Just follow the money.
Hello and welcome to this special episode of Follow the Money and After America. I'm Glenn Connley. Australians are often told that our alliance with the United States transcends prime ministers and presidents. In fact, former Minister for Defence Christopher Pyne told the independent public inquiry into AUKUS almost exactly that last week.
We're a democracy, but more importantly, we have very deep and strong relationships with the United States, and they transcend presidents that come and go.
And with the ANZUS alliance due to mark its 75th anniversary in September, the partnership certainly has transcended leaders for generations. But we've never seen a leader like Donald Trump.
This is a fraud on the American public. This is an embarrassment to our country.
Today, I'm very proud of myself. Our president has finally released a birth certificate.
We were getting ready to win this election. Frankly, we did win this election. Members of the deep state, very, very famous group of people, in many cases, in our intelligence agency work to actively suppress and downplay information about the extent of China's sinister election meddling.
Trump has spent much of his political career undermining America's faith in democracy. And since returning to office for a second term, Trump and his administration have chipped away at the pillars of US democracy, the rule of law, independent media, and elections themselves. No one knows what will happen at the midterms in November, nor at the 2028 presidential election. Probably not even Trump himself. But with the American democracy looking increasingly fragile, the Australian government needs to be prepared for the worst. With me today to discuss the state of American democracy and the Australia-US alliance is Dr. Emma Shortis, Director of International and Security Affairs at the Australia Institute. Welcome, Emma.
Thanks, Glenn. Thanks for having me.
Look, Emma, I was lucky enough to have an overseas holiday recently, but got back and sort of caught up on US news, largely through watching the World Cup. One, Donald Trump had a red card overturned, but the other was the trophy presentation. You couldn't get him off the stage again. It was just the clown show rolls on, Emma.
Yeah, it really does, Glenn. I mean, we say this a lot about the Trump administration, that it is simultaneously like so embarrassing and also so dangerous, and both things are possible at once. But yeah, the spectacle of the president being on the stage during the trophy presentation for the Spanish team and kind of having to be like dragged off by Infantino, the FIFA chief, was pretty embarrassing, but I think also kind of deliberate by Trump. You know, I think, and you know, this is just my speculation, Trump has been really aggressive when it comes to Spain, calling Spain terrible, their government terrible, threatening to cut off all trade. And so it almost seemed like he kind of wanted to spoil that photo. But again, that's just me guessing. You know, we know how Trump is very petty and loves to hold a grudge.
Well, at least the orange was a good fit. Let's talk about Iran. It's that roller coaster once again catching up on news. I see he briefly suggested the US would impose a tariff on goods that went through the Strait of Hormuz that didn't seem to last long.
No, it didn't. There was a pretty quick turnaround. I guess it's worth saying he has floated this idea before that, you know, if Iran wanted to charge a fee, then the United States would charge a fee as well. It has been pointed out to him, I think, that basically US power and US empire has rested on this idea of free and open ocean trade in particular, and undoing that might be pretty risky. So he's walked it back again and suggested that instead of that 20% fee, there would be free movement of ships except for Iran, which is under a blockade, and that maybe the Gulf states, the Arab Gulf states, might like to invest some money in the United States instead of those fees. So I'm sure those Gulf leaders are listening very carefully.
But even by merely suggesting it, right, doesn't that sort of play into Iran's hands that this is a weapon and indeed some sort of toll can be charged by whomever?
I think so. My colleague, John Wolfstall, who we've had on our podcast After America a few times, has put it really clearly. He has said Iran is better at this than Trump. He keeps falling into these strategic traps, setting precedents around charging fees and pointing out to the Iranians, who are already very aware, just what a strategic asset the strait is, that being able to close it and open it and threaten it and stop ships from going through is a huge strategic advantage, which, the Trump administration just clearly is not capable of dealing with because Trump is, flip-flopping all over the place. So this is, a strategic black hole, really, that Trump is just not able to climb out of. And he's not willing to do the work, I should say, to climb out of it. This requires really hard diplomacy, and Trump just doesn't have the staying power to do that.
And in other news, 50% tariffs now on Canada for daring to have bushfires.
Yeah. We just keep rolling on, don't we? Having like the same kind of deja vu conversations. But yes, the latest in Trump tariffs is a 50% on a bunch of Canadian goods, including things like hockey sticks, which the White House is saying is in retaliation for the Canadians not treating US goods properly. But it's quite clear that this is Trump cracking it about wildfire smoke. Much of Canada is facing catastrophic wildfires, and as a result, the air quality in both Canada and the United States is really poor. So Trump is saying that this is Canada's fault. He's engaging in conspiracy theories around, the lack of forest management, which would be very familiar to an Australian audience, blaming the Canadian government for it and imposing these 50% tariffs as a punishment, I guess, which hasn't really got heaps of coverage in Australia, but, it really strikes me that this is a kind of precedent that should be deeply worrying to Australians and the Australian government in particular. The last catastrophic bushfire season that we had in Australia, smoke from those bushfires literally circumnavigated the globe. Are we cool with setting a precedent where the countries that are affected by that smoke can punish Australia economically? Is that the kind of system that we want to build? I don't think so, but I haven't really seen much coverage of that in Australia.
Tonight, I'm announcing the immediate declassification and release of critical intelligence revealing shocking vulnerabilities in our election infrastructure. The Chinese government wanted U.S. president to lose the next election, and the reason they wanted me to lose is because they knew I was wise to them. Put together, these disclosures reveal an election system so broken and so vulnerable that no one can possibly defend it. It is not defensible.
And then the other crazy recent thing to catch up on was his address to the nation, which was a sort of rambling about democracy already sort of preemptively undermining maybe if the midterms go badly. Maybe set up where we are for these midterms, who's up for re-election and what we think might be happening.
Yeah, sure. So the midterm elections happen in November this year. They happen, these are congressional elections. So it's for all seats in the House of Representatives, about 400 of them, and a third of the seats in the Senate. And there are 100 seats in the Senate. So these elections happen every 2 years, and they're designed really to coincide with presidential elections and then to go halfway through a presidential term as a kind of check, really, on the presidency. In an ideal world, that's how they're designed to be a check on the president. And for that reason, I guess, Trump and Republicans are deeply worried about what might happen in the midterms because Trump is polling so poorly. He's historically unpopular for a US president. The suggestion is that in, I guess, what we might describe as a normal midterm election cycle, the Republicans would be looking at a midterm wipeout. They'd be looking at losing control of the House of Representatives and potentially even the Senate, which is unusual in midterms because the Senate is often so close. So it's looking pretty bad in that sense for Republicans. But again, this isn't a normal election cycle, so I don't think we can rely on, I guess, old assumptions about how these cycles work.
And so what's he trying to do? Is he preemptively undermining it in case it goes badly? Is he trying to scare Democratic voters away from showing up, with all this suggestion of having to take your passport and your citizenship papers and what have you?
Yeah. I think he's doing all of those things at once, Glenn. He has consistently attempted to undermine Americans' faith in their political system and their electoral system. He's done that really since 2016, where he kind of has this consistent line that, if he loses an election, it's because it's rigged. It's because of cheating. That's the only possible way that Trump could lose. And Americans already, don't have, I guess, heaps of faith in that electoral system for a number of reasons, historic reasons around, for example, the suppression of black votes or the way the Electoral College works. So Trump is playing on existing, I think, fears around the election system and attempting to kind of take them to the next level so that Americans have no faith in electoral outcomes, which means he can manipulate them, if he loses. But he is also, as you rightly say, I think, attempting to suppress the vote, to create that apathy or to trade off apathy that already exists where, Americans kind of throw up their hands and go, well, what's the point of voting anyway if the system is so rigged or if Trump is so focused on rigging the system? My vote isn't going to mean anything, so why should I bother? And, turnout is a problem in systems where voting is not compulsory. So Trump's kind of trying to do all of those things at once, as he's also trying to use legislation and the Supreme Court to undermine voting rights, to undermine basically people's ability to have their vote counted, all things being equal. So this is, I guess, a kind of full court press attack on the institutions of American democracy.
Could this be that he's looking ahead to 28 and, there's a theory maybe he wants to undermine the system so badly he can say in 28, well, I've got to stay in office till we fix this sort of thing?
Well, I mean, some of his supporters are encouraging him, Glenn, to do that before 2028, to do that for the midterms, to, as he has done, declare the American electoral system. He basically described it as indefensible, so corroded that it cannot be relied upon. And the logical conclusion of that is that you have to sweep it all away, or you have to declare an emergency, delay elections. And certainly many of his supporters in the kind of right-wing podcast influencer universe are encouraging him to do that sooner rather than later. Some of his officials, like Stephen Miller, for example, are basically like salivating over invoking the Insurrection Act. But certainly, to get back to your question, Trump is looking to 2028 and ways to hold on to power, to stay in office. I mean, he's quote unquote joked for a long time about potentially serving an unconstitutional third term and how he might do that. So certainly Trump and Republicans are looking to 2028 and to holding on to power. I think it's worth kind of seeing this in the context that Trump's last election victory was a generational one for the right, the conservative movement broadly in the United States. He gave them the executive in the presidency, he gave them Congress, he's given them the Supreme Court. They're not going to give that up easily. And as they tie themselves ever closer to Trump, the risks of giving that up get bigger and bigger. The risks of legal consequences, for example, for what they're doing get bigger and bigger. So they will hold on, I think, ever tighter in the lead up to both the midterms and the presidential elections in 2028.
But most importantly, addressing this crisis of election security demands that Congress must pass the Save America Act. How easy is that to do unless you want to cheat? The only reason you wouldn't do it is you want to cheat because your policies are so bad and your candidates are so pathetic that you can't get away or can't get elected any other way.
So what is this Save America Act that's stalled? What's in it and what effect could it have?
So this is an act that's before Congress that Trump is kind of obsessed with passing. He mentioned it in this national address, and it is the SAVE Act is basically part of the Trump administration's broader plan to undermine voting rights, hollow out the American democratic system in exactly the way that we've been talking about. So what it would do is things like requiring voter ID, for example, so matching voter ID to voter registration, which would quite deliberately disenfranchise millions of Americans, especially immigrants and especially women, who have changed their name after marriage, for example, and will have all kinds of problems with voter ID. It would also do things like ban mail-in ballots, which again, disenfranchises a lot of people quite deliberately. So Trump wants to pass this to increase Republicans' chances at the midterms, to the point where he is refusing to sign other pieces of bipartisan popular legislation around housing, for example, as a way of trying to blackmail Congress to pass this act. It's currently stalled in the Senate, and it doesn't look like senators, including some Republican senators, will be willing to pass it. But if they do, it would have huge implications for the midterms and again, looking forward to 2028.
So just picking up on a couple of things you said there. So is non-citizens voting, is that a big problem? Do many do it?
Not at all. Trump claims it's a huge problem all the time. He did in that national address. There is no evidence of that happening or being an issue. But it is, of course, playing into Trump's demonization of immigrants, his particular white supremacist language around floods of immigrants coming to the United States and swaying elections in favor of Democrats. So this is all, I guess, part of that broader ideology around what American society should look like and who should have power in that society. And when it comes to the Trump administration and the movement more broadly, the answer to who should have power is white men. It's really very straightforward. And so that, I guess that's how ideologically that all kind of fits together.
And obviously, theoretically, he's never going to be up for an election again. But typically in the US at this time, if the incumbent is performing badly, is his party or their party punished?
Yes, historically, midterms are generally seen, it's an oversimplification, but generally midterms are seen as a referendum on the presidency. So if a president is struggling in the opinion polls, then generally you will see the result of that at the midterms, where the president's party will suffer. They will lose control of the House. Like the most obvious example is the Obama administration's first term in 2010. They lost control of the House. And thereafter, it kind of became a lame duck presidency where legislation just couldn't get passed because it was blocked by Republicans who controlled the House. Things are a little bit different now, though, Glenn, because Congress isn't really passing legislation. It's so stuck that it doesn't actually do much. And so presidents are kind of ruling by executive order, kind of issuing decrees from the White House and governing that way. So whether that substantively actually changes things for Trump if he loses control, if Republicans lose control of Congress is, I guess, an open question because Trump has shown a willingness to totally disregard and ignore Congress. And Republicans in Congress have been happy to indulge that as well.
I'm interested, Emma, in some of the things he's doing that will be really hard to undo. Like you can always take his name off a building or whatever, pull down a monument to himself. But you mentioned the Supreme Court before, there's decision on the Voting Rights Act and the way he's stacked the court or people he's, top bureaucrats he's put into place. It's going to be much harder to undo once he's gone, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's why there is so much attention, Glenn, on the Supreme Court, because those justices are appointed for life. So Trump has appointed basically ideologically aligned justices to the Supreme Court, and they're giving decisions around things like the Voting Rights Act that ideologically align with the conservative movement and with Trumpism more broadly. And so undoing that actually requires pretty radical, in the American sense of the word, quite radical reform of the system that could involve, reform of the Supreme Court. So adding more justices, creating term limits, whatever it is, something that the system has been unable to do really for decades, if not, since the beginning. So undoing that kind of work would be very difficult. And I think establishment Democrats in particular have shown a reluctance to do that, to kind of radically mess with the system. And that, again, as you say, has long-term consequences. As a result of this Voting Rights Act decision, the Supreme Court has effectively said to states, like, you can gerrymander as much as you want to partisan ends, go ahead and do it. And states are going ahead and doing it. And that has big implications for the electoral map, for how many seats are locked in to Republicans or Democrats one way or the other. So you're right, I think, to point out that this is much bigger than just Trump himself.
And even some of his old decisions that he's forgotten and moved on. I mean, we're seeing ICE agents still shooting civilians in the street.
Yeah, it's horrifying. And, we've had 2 deaths at the hands of ICE agents. Again, in the last week or so, Trump made some noise about stopping vehicle stops, which is where most of these killings have taken place, but then reversed that. And so in all likelihood, we will continue to see headlines like that, that people dying at the hands of ICE agents, people dying in custody as well, in ICE custody, because the Trump administration, not just Trump himself, but the administration more broadly, has effectively created an agency that has no guardrails, that has no accountability, that's taking on, in the case of one ICE agent who was involved in a recent death, whose family has described and documented a long history of domestic violence, and, letting them out armed onto the streets to exercise effectively unlimited power where they know there will be no accountability. And that is incredibly dangerous for, obviously, Americans on the streets and for the rule of law more broadly in the United States.
And how do you think it's all being viewed here as Trump gaffe, error, disaster, as they pile up? We've noticed, One Nation's polling's a bit slipped. Do you think those two things are related?
I certainly think that's possible, Glenn. I'd go back to our last federal election where the sense that Peter Dutton was trying to be Trump light, or kind of Timu Trump, as our colleague Amy Romakis likes to say, really hurt the Liberals. And I think, an association between One Nation and the Trump administration, sometimes through mining billionaires, is not necessarily positive, I guess, for their opinion, for their results in opinion polls. And certainly, having just returned from Europe and talking to colleagues in Europe, progressive colleagues in Europe kind of see the American far right as really useful. Whenever J.D. Vance goes over to campaign for the far right in Hungary, for example, it hurts them. That association hurts them. There's a reason that the right-wing Italian leader, for example, is distancing herself quite dramatically from Trump. So the information, the evidence that we have, including polling information, suggests that Australians are deeply skeptical of Trump. They don't trust him. They don't trust his administration. And they find what he's doing, deeply, deeply worrying.
Where does AUKUS fit into all of this, Emma? I mean, obviously there's a public inquiry going on at the moment. Christopher Pyne was sort of saying, presidents come and go, he'll go and it will endure. How do you think everything happening there at the moment is affecting the way Australians think about AUKUS, if not maybe the way the government behaves about AUKUS?
Yeah, those are two very different things, aren't they? It's important to distinguish between them. Look, I think, in reporting on this, we keep hearing that, Christopher Pyne's line, basically, that the alliance, the relationship is bigger than prime ministers or presidents. And broadly speaking, that has been true. The alliance, the security alliance in terms of the ANZUS Treaty is 75 years old this year. Clearly, it outlives individual leaders. And the assumption is that is because it is underpinned by shared values, a shared view of the world, a shared commitment to, the albeit imperfect international rules-based order. And I think much of our polling suggests that Australians are distinguishing between our relationship, our broadly conceived relationship with the United States, and Donald Trump and what he is doing. And so you'll see polls come out of other think tanks, particularly kind of foreign policy focused think tanks like the Lowy Institute, where trust in Donald Trump is falling off a cliff, but Australians' support for the alliance or the relationship is still, pretty high. Like it's falling a little bit, but it's generally pretty high and pretty consistent. And so I think that, distinguishing is important. Like, Australians are deeply concerned about what's happening in the United States, about what Trump is doing. We do have that kind of sense of shared history, of shared values, of like relatively similar, or a sense of relatively similar political systems, shared culture, etc. So I think that distinction is important and it's healthy. Where I'm skeptical is how that, perceived support for the relationship is often kind of conflated with support for AUKUS or support for what we might call the capital A alliance, like the security military alliance. I think there is growing skepticism about that because of Trump, and we can see that in polling research that we've done in the Australia Institute around assessments of the reliability of the United States, like not necessarily the reliability of the Trump administration, but the reliability of the United States more broadly, which again, is low and getting lower as we continue to do that research. Where that sits with AUKUS is, again, a little bit difficult to kind of tease out, but basically in the results that we've got in our polling research and in other results from other polling research, we can sort of see that things roughly fall into thirds. So it's kind of a third support for the AUKUS submarine deal, a third against, and a third not sure or don't know. And that's a really high number in these kind of polls where 30% of Australians aren't sure about biggest defense project we've ever embarked upon as a country. So, that tells me there's still a fair bit of explaining to do. Like, in the 5 years since the AUKUS deal was announced, it hasn't been adequately explained to Australians so that they understand, what the justification for it is, if there is one. And I would argue that there isn't really one. And I think what we're also seeing is that as Australians get more information about the AUKUS submarine deal, as they, become aware, for example, that basically the whole thing is up to the US president. The US president can decide whether or not we do end up getting those submarines. They become increasingly skeptical about it. So I guess that's a long way of saying that, Australians are deeply skeptical of Trump. That makes many of them, about a third, pretty unsure about the AUKUS submarine deal. But, at the same time, we are deeply concerned about the Trump administration, what it's doing in the world, and the state of American democracy. And as you pointed out, when you ask this question, Glenn, that doesn't gel necessarily so well with how the government is approaching the relationship.
I feel like there's an inevitability about a really messy fight, either over the midterms or in 28 or sometime between now and then. What might a disputed election result do to the already sceptical view of Australians towards their important alliance partner?
This is something I think about a lot. I think, again, as I was just saying, Australians are deeply worried about the state of American democracy. I think we all remember January 6th quite clearly and how easily that could have gone a different way, and what that might have meant for Australia. So I think, Australians would have the obvious reaction to that kind of contested election result, to, Donald Trump effectively trying to steal an election again. What probably worries me more is the general lack of preparation for that worst case scenario. And it is a worst case scenario. It's certainly not inevitable. There are a lot of moving parts. But what worries me most is that I can't see, at least from the outside, that the Australian government is prepared for that worst case scenario. What are they going to do if that worst case scenario does play out? If Trump attempts to steal an election, if Trump successfully steals an election, what does that mean for the shared values that supposedly underpin that alliance? What does it mean for AUKUS? What does it mean for Australia? Are they prepared? What are they going to say in that case? I think January 6th caught the Australian government out in that it wasn't prepared for that worst case scenario. It didn't know what to say, really. And my concern is that it's going to be caught scrambling again in that situation because, when we're talking about that worst case scenario, the effective collapse of American democracy, that has enormous implications for Australia, particularly given, our deeply entwined relationship with the United States, and how we respond to that is going to be pretty critical. And again, I'm just not seeing the evidence that the government is prepared for that worst case outcome.
Doesn't it always make you feel grateful for compulsory voting and the Australian Electoral Commission? God, how much do they need an Australian Electoral Commission over there?
Yeah, like I think we often underestimate how much we actually, in terms of our democracy, have to offer the rest of the world in that sense, and particularly our American friends.
Fantastic, Emma. Thank you very much. Great to catch up.
Always a pleasure. Thanks so much, Glenn.
If you want to read more about the Australia-US relationship, Emma's 2025 Vantage Point essay, After America, Australia and the New World Order, recently went to reprint. It's available for just $19.95 from Australia Institute Press or via the link in the show notes. Use the code PODVP, that's PODVP, at checkout to receive free shipping. This episode was recorded on Tuesday, the 21st of July, 2026. Our theme music is by Jonathan McFeet from Pulse and Thrum, with additional music from Blue Dot Sessions. I'm Glenn Connley. Thanks for listening.